Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on The Story Within, we retell those moments, honest every day, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. They say the Gulf air keeps secrets the way salt keeps scars quietly without fuss. My name is Maggie Whitaker, and I'm 76 now, but what I'm about to tell sits in the heat shimmer of the summer of 1974 in Biloxi, Mississippi, when I was still young enough to believe a good ironing could smooth anything out. We lived on a low white ranch with a carport that ticked after sundown and a hibiscus that tried to turn the mailbox into a jungle. The screen door never shut right. It banged if you didn't mind it, a sharp clap that traveled the whole house. On Saturday mornings, the radio in the kitchen coughed up Hank Williams and local weather. On Sundays, the church bells from St. Paul's wandered over the live oaks and told us where we were supposed to be. Cal, my husband, Calhoun Whitaker, wore his jackets, even when the humidity made a liar of the thermometer. He was a lawyer, other men introduced with their chins up, Cal Whitaker, counselor. He belonged to committees, chaired luncheons, dotted his I's like someone grading himself. In the front pew, he sang low. On the courthouse steps, he shook hands and said, "Yes, sir," and "my pleasure," and people liked the sound of it. Our two kids were halved from different cloth. Owen at 10 was a sky watcher with a dog-eared star chart pinned over his bed, a pencil tucked behind his ear as if a meteor might need it. June at 8 decorated the margins of everything with flowers and women in improbable hats. Life in that house moved on a narrow track. Iron Mondays, grocery Tuesdays, fish on Fridays because the market near the pier had a habit of closing early if the hangars ran thin. The Sunday that bends everything started like any other supper prep after church, a jug of sweet tea, sweating on a cloth my mother hemmed when she still believed in hymns. Cal said he had a brief or two to glance at, and tapped the stack of folders on his way out the way some men pat a dog. He kissed June on the top of her head without scuffing the ribbon, told Owen to keep the telescope capped in daylight, and left me with a pan of pecans to toast and a wavering pressure tightening behind my eyes. Sinus is that old enemy the coast never cured. There is a certain permission a closed house gives a woman when the sun lays on a roof and the children are occupied. I told myself I'd find a decongestant, nothing more, because Cal kept the stronger tablets in the only room he called his own. He had a sign he joked about hanging "No admittance ideas" at work. But the door itself, a varnished pocket of tobacco scent and man-made order, did a fine job of warning without the hardware. I paused in the hallway anyway, fingertips on the cool trim, then pushed through. His study had that measured stillness of a place that's been arranged. Pens aligned, casebooks, squared a glass paperweight holding down nothing but its own good looks. The ceiling fan burned a slow circle. Somewhere outside, a truck downshifted on Pass Road and made a sound like a throat clearing. I moved toward the second file cabinet where he kept the odds and ends bank envelopes, a catalog or two, an old roll of film he'd never sent off. The sinus tablets I knew from past appeals were in the top drawer of the oak desk on the left. I opened it and found the bottle rattled at once to test the world, and then, because human hands are not made of the same restraint as voices, weighed the heavy thing on the corner of his desk. The blue-spined Rand McNally World Atlas 1968 edition, the one he used when he played Guess the Capital with Owen. I wish I could say I was graceful. I was not. My elbow nudged the atlas as I reached for the glass of water he kept for paper plants, clear, unstirred, and the book slid. It went with a slap against the braided rug, and a fresh sound I didn't recognize. A dry whisper, as if a leaf had tried to speak. Something had shaken loose from inside and landed just under the desk lip. I knelt the rug, biting my knees, and pinched a strip of light brown paper between two fingers. It was a telegram slip, the kind the phone company still used when a message needed a hurry, and one edge was singed, as if it had parked too close to a cigarette and thought better of it. The typed words sat in their little boxes, uneven and worse for travel. "If she starts asking, stop. Make it look like an accident. Stop, P." The house contracted. The fan's slow circle counted to 10 and back. We were not a family that received telegrams, not in 1974, and certainly not in a lawyer's desk tucked inside a map of the world. I read it again because sense demands a second look, and my breath stumbled over the same snag. "If she starts asking, make it look like an accident. A period isn't much of a weapon unless someone means it." I knew one man whose name began with P, intimately enough to crowd my thoughts, Peter Lang, Cal's partner. Peter had a sailor's tan and a salesman's patience. He attended potlucks with a casserole the ladies forgave on account of the dish it traveled in. He called me Miss Maggie as if the title kept the world polite. I put the telegram on the desk and flattened it with my palm. Just a heartbeat, then slid it back between pages near the Gulf Coast, Alabama, fading into Florida barrier islands like crumbs. When I lifted the atlas, Something else caught the light, a matchbook half buried in the rug. The Mariner, it said, in skinny blue cursive Bay St. Louis. On the inside flap in a hand that looked like Cal's leaned over printing a single word, Thursdays. I pressed the matches closed and felt the little spine of them knock against my thumb. There is an economy to fear. It shrinks a person to her edges. I returned what wasn't mine to where it pretended to belong, the matchbook, into the little ceramic bowl with paper clips and a knotted ribbon, the telegram between atlas pages 13 and 14, and arranged the desk as if the room had never noticed me. Then I took 2 white tablets with their chalky relief set the glass back exactly where a faint ring had taught it to live, and closed the drawer with a sound nearly too soft to hear. The kitchen had cooled a degree by the time I came back. June had cut her paper doll a new dress and was smoothing tape with the seriousness of a surgeon. Owen had collected the unused ice from his water glass and engineered a small Mississippi River in the shallow green sink. I salted the pecans, turned the stove off with my knuckle, and felt the ache in my head bow out to a wider ache that had no pharmacy answer. When Cal returned later, the late light put a brace of gold on the backs of his hands as he untied his tie. He smelled like his cologne, the good kind he saved for court days, and the courthouse itself, paper dust, dry air. He said the traffic on Howard Ave had been a circus that the county clerk couldn't find her way out of a copy room that committees had added 2 more meetings to his week. I laughed in the right places, set the roast on the table, complained about the price of peaches. He reached for the salt with 2 fingers as if it might disagree with him, and asked Owen about the Perseids. He was a man performing the role of a man, and I was the woman who knew her lines. After supper I washed the dishes and left them inverted on the towel to dry. I wiped the table until the oil in the wood woke up and shone, turned off the radio, and checked the back door twice out of habit. In the hallway I paused at the desk calendar tacked to the corkboard and drew a light circle around an ordinary word I'd scribbled earlier from the market ad peaches August fruit, now serving as a second language only. I understood. Then I went to tuck the children in, listened to Owen describe the dark, as if it were Chartable kissed June's sweet goodnight breath, and returned to our narrow bed where the ceiling fan kept its steady bargain with the heat, and the night along the coast held itself very, very still. The days that followed did not rattle their dishes or shout their news. They went on as days do on the coast, heat gathering under noon thunderheads rehearsing, and then thinking better of it, the screen door announcing itself whether invited or not. I ironed shirts with a care that would have suited a state flag set. Peaches to ripen on the sill. The fuzz taking the afternoon light, the way a cat tolerates affection. Owen mapped the night sky in pencil grids. June stitched paper dresses for paper girls and named each one after a flower the yard could not grow. If you had driven by our white house on Eisenhower Drive, you might have kept driving. Thursday was written in the bone of that matchbook, so I let Thursday find me in a way that did not ping the world. Mid-afternoon I told Cal I'd be taking a pan of deviled eggs to the church ladies. He said he had a meeting that might edge long and smooth the sleeve that was already smooth. I set Owen up with the Sears telescope manual as if it were the Old Testament told June not to cut until she'd drawn twice, and left a note by the milk saying I'd be back by supper. The carport air smelled like someone had hung hot pennies beneath the eaves. I drove the Pontiac toward the highway hands, even on the wheel the radio low, the windows cracked, to let the salt do what it could. US 90 keeps its promises. Live oaks bowed and then rose. The Gulf winked through gaps, like a secret you swear isn't yours. Bay St. Louis arrived with its sleepy storefronts, and its pilings blackened from storms that were older than any of us. The Mariner lived in a low building with an overhang and neon that thought it was evening all day. Inside, the light did a small blue trick to the shadows, and everything smelled like shrimp baskets and lemon slices divorced from their better halves. The bar mirror did what mirrors do in small towns. It made you see twice. I stood in the doorway long enough to let my eyes agree with the place, then went to the counter to order a fried oyster po' boy to go. The chalkboard behind the bar read Thursdays, in a hand that had learned its letters after the war and never saw a reason to change. A jukebox muttered an old song and seemed offended by the quarter it had earned for it. When I turned to pass the time with a polite scan, the mirror offered me a second-room back booth far right, Cal's profile in that careful half-light, and opposite him a young woman with hair that fell in a straight auburn line to her shoulder, her fingers worrying a napkin until it surrendered into shapes. He leaned in. She answered with her eyes. The waitress set down a basket and the bottle of hot sauce that this place called Universal. Cal's wedding ring flashed once as he reached for it. Then his hand settled near hers, not touching in the way touching can be. Her face was not hard. She wore a teacher's tired and careful and 9-to-5er's lipstick, a simple gold chain. The conversation was not the loud kind. It belonged to people who believe rooms will forgive them. I watched without being anybody who would require notice. A man on a stool beside me asked for change and then forgot why he'd asked for it. The bartender refilled a water glass for someone who had not asked. A gull laughed outside the way gulls do when they take what they took from a child on the pier. The to-go bag came with a receipt stapled to it, ink damp from the machine. As the bartender reached across, he slid a small white box with the restaurant's logo nearer to me, the way certain places make their matchbooks into little advertisements for decisions. The Mariner Bay, St. Louis. I took one without making it mean anything it didn't already mean. In the mirror, Peter Lang's voice arrived before Peter Lang's suit. He stepped into the frame with the counselor's smile he kept for cameras and funerals. He did not look around to register a world in which I stood. He went straight to their booth, said something with a hand on Cal's shoulder like men do when they are practicing being brothers, and then placed an envelope on the table that matched the kind banks prefer. The envelope's corner showed a stamp from a print shop in Gulfport, and the words, Cypress Holdings, faint enough you could call it a coincidence if you needed one. The bartender called, "Ma'am, your sandwich will steam itself to death," which was his way of being kind. I paid, left a cash tip to make my face forget itself, and went out into the soft dark that the afternoon had become. On the sidewalk, the air lifted a little rain flirting, and then choosing not to marry. I set the paper bag on the passenger seat, as if it were a lapful of cat, and drove back along that comb of highway with the Gulf combing itself beyond it. At home, I slid the sandwich onto a plate and cut it in half because that's what you do for children who are not going to eat it. June asked why the bread wore powder and whether powder belonged on bread. Owen had a new page of notes on the Perseids. He read them as if instruments were listening. Cal walked in at 6:30, exactly late enough to be reasonable. He smelled like the courthouse and the cologne he saved for when he needed to be taller. He didn't kiss me hello. He patted Owen's hair, a father's apology wrapped in habit, and asked if we had enough ice for tea. We did. He said the clerk's office had discovered a new rule for old files, and Peter had opinions about it, and could we pass the okra, please? I passed it as if the bowl had nothing to do with me. Laundry is a language. It tells you where a man placed his day. After the dishes, I brought the hamper into our room and made small hills on the bed collars to the left, socks to the right. The navy jacket he favored dropped a little heavier than it should. In the inside pocket, my fingers met a slick rectangle, and that rectangle announced itself with embossed type when I brought it to light Dupre & Sons Jewelers, Gulfport. Below there was a description, cultured pearl strand, 18 inches clasp in 14K, and a number that would have paid the electric bill through Christmas. There was also a stamped card paperclip to it. Gulf Coast First Savings Private Client Appointment, Friday, Sunghuzuru PM, Whitaker. I did not make a sound, small or large. I set the receipt beneath the braids of the jacket lining and left the card in place, as if I had never taught my children to leave things better than they found them. I pressed the jacket flat and slid it back into its dark. When I lifted his briefcase to move it to the chair, the latch complained. That was the briefcase's habit, not mine. The contents inside shifted the way contents do when a day has gone over a bump. I angled it just enough for the flap to give me its permission and saw the gray lip of a file stamped in blue, Gulf Rebuild Relief Disbursements. Another file beneath it wore the beachfront name of a company that had not existed in our kitchen until it arrived there on an envelope, Cypress Holdings, LLC. I did not read the numbers. I saw them the way you glimpse your reflection in a window at night. Then I closed the case until its complaint resolved into a click, ironed the shirts that had waited for the iron, folded the towels into hotel squares, and stacked order on top of order. Peter Lang came by the next afternoon wearing the kind of summer suit that makes heat think twice. He carried a bottle bearing the color Bourbon Promises and a grin like something bought wholesale. "Miss Maggie," he said, tilting his head 3/4, "we figured we owed you the good stuff for sharing Cal with the county so much this week. Men who talk like that always mean more than they are saying and less than they believe." I poured him 2 fingers, and him alone. He held the glass without drinking it, and let his gaze orbit what a living room offers the framed school photos. The crocheted throw my mother made in the same 3 colors she used for everything. Owen's balsa airplane from last summer suspended on fishing line. June's paper lady leaning against a book spine as if a breeze might persuade her to become real. "Busy season," Peter said. "Funds to track hands to shake the usual parade." Behind the grin, a thread of impatience, the kind you hear when a man thinks the band ought to change songs. He set a manila envelope on the coffee table and rested 2 fingers on it like a magician about to choose a card. The top corner flashed a letterhead, Cypress Holdings, the font, skinny and self-important. I asked if they'd be staying for supper. He laughed as if laughter could tidy something. Wouldn't dream of imposing, he said, just needed Cal to witness a signature. The word witness had a courtroom's gravity and a backroom's wink. I collected the envelope with my eyes and then let it go. In the kitchen, the pecans remembered how to toast themselves without burning. In the hallway, I could hear Owen hum the low part of something he'd picked up from the radio. On Friday, I drove into Gulfport under the premise of returning a library book that was already returned. I parked 2 blocks from Gulf Coast First Savings, where sand tracked the marble like reluctance does. The bank wore its air like an old woman's pearls, proud of being exactly itself. I stood in the shade of the live oak as if shade were a hobby, and watched the glass doors behave like a back-to-back stage. At 2:10, Cal appeared with a man who breathed banker their heads close, as if oxygen were not free. Peter came in from the south side lot, his tie pinned like it feared a breeze, and joined the pair with a hand on Cal's arm in a move he favored. I could not hear words, but bodies say what they say, shoulders hard, jaw angles cut by hunger, humor deployed like a bridge to be crossed and burned. A clerk carried a stack of cashier's checks toward an office. A woman from the loans desk walked by with a file cart, and the look of someone who knows where money likes to rest before it moves. I slid into the lobby when an elderly man in a hat needed the door, and he thanked me as if I had donated something larger than my hand. Inside the tile held a coolness that felt northern. I waited at a small table and filled out an address change form I did not need while I watched reflections lift and settle on the glass walls of the private rooms. I recognized the manager from rotary photos in the newspaper. He handed Cal a pen that was heavier than its job, then stepped back the way people do when they've delivered a thing. I did not stay long enough to see anyone leave. I left the form unfinished and the pen alone and walked back into sun, where heat asserted itself, and a dog tied to a bollard looked at me as if we were in the same family. At the library, I checked out a book I would not read, just so the errand had a spine. On the way home, I bought peaches I did not need because peaches, even unneeded, can be righteous. That night, the children fell asleep tangled in summer sheets at their feet, cheeks damp, the fan lifting hair and letting it fall. Cal came to bed late with a shower on him and a silence that believed in itself. He lay on his back and counted the ceiling fan's circle without admitting it. After Labor Day, he said to the air, "We'll get some breathing room." He did not say from what. The sentence went into the dark and parked. I said nothing because nothing properly used is a more complicated word than yes. His breathing eventually arranged itself into the steady music of a man convinced a day had obeyed him. In the laundry room, the old tin of buttons lived behind the starch. I lifted the lid and slid 2 slips of paper inside a copy of the jeweler's receipt I had made by hand, while the house blinked my penciled note of the bank appointment. The tin clinked the way small metal sounds do when they are telling you to keep steady. I set it back where dust knew it and turned off the light. In the kitchen, the peaches on the sill had ripened and tipped toward sweetness. I breathed in the room that had been my room since we carried our first box through the door. It held. The house kept its posture. The night returned to itself. The matchbook from the bar sat in the drawer with the twine and the good scissors, a small white hinge with blue letters waiting without saying so. Saturday dawned with a heat that knew where the curtains leaked. I set biscuits in the oven and watched the dough rise like it believed in itself. Cal read the paper with the front page folded just so, as if news behaved better when it kept its chin down. He circled an article about zoning the pencil dark where it pressed. Owen argued with a diagram for a rocket he planned to build from cardboard. June's paper ladies had acquired hats and a dog. When Cal left for the office, quick things back by lunch, his shoes clicked a lawyer's tempo down the hall. The door closed and the house exhaled. Money is not a shelter until it learns your name. I took the coffee can from the pantry and counted what seams and sleeves had surrendered over the years, a slow weather of bills, tips from hems and buttonholes, change from the corner bakery. Then I pulled a 20 from the flour tin I used for hiding and a 10 from the tin of buttons that had kept our quiet for 3 summers. I wrote a note for the children practice piano, no scissors near the cat, and a second for the neighbor across the street who liked to keep an eye on things. The Pontiac answered with a cough and then found its voice. I eased onto Pass Road, then north through pine stands where heat held its hand over the needles. Hattiesburg waited an hour up the map, ordinary enough to be useful. At Gulf and Timber Savings, the lobby was cool in the way old banks are, as if marble can hoard December. A woman with a nameplate that said Beale wore a blouse the color of a robin's egg, and smiled a smile that had seen every kind of request the South can make in a week. I gave her my maiden name, Margaret Doyle, and kept my married one behind my teeth. She did not ask for Cal's signature. She did not ask for anyone's permission. She asked for identification, which I provided, and a signature of my own. The pen laid down a line that felt like a road built where there had only been ruts. "How much to start, Miss Doyle?" she asked. "It won't be pretty," I said, "but it will be honest." She counted without comment and slid a small ledger book across the desk. "Come when you like," she said, and meant the words with that bank kind of meaning, a place that is not home agreeing to hold a piece of it. Back in Biloxi, the afternoon shook itself off a storm without bothering to rain. Cal's car was in the drive. Peter's parked behind it, at an angle confident enough to be rude. The voices in the study carried in that precise way men's voices do when they think a door and a title can unmake sound. I set the grocery sack on the counter and moved like someone who can't find the right drawer. In the linen cabinet behind the good tablecloth with the grape embroidery sat the brown vinyl rectangle my sister had mailed us. The Christmas Owen turned 3, a little Panasonic cassette recorder with a red dot that meant on and a mic no bigger than a thimble. Be kind, I told it, and slid the cabinet door back. If you stand in our hallway and lean a dish towel on the knob of the study door, you can pretend to be fussy about smudges long enough to drop a small thing to the baseboard and nudge it into place with your shoe. The recorder hid between the trim and the spun sugar of dust that even women like me leave for later. I pressed record and went to the kitchen to rinse lettuce leaves I did not plan to eat. I'm telling you, we're cutting it close, Peter said, the sentence clipped as if words were labor you shouldn't waste. You line up disbursements like that, someone's going to ask why the Gulf rebuild checks are making 3 stops before the dock. The dock is a metaphor, Pete Cal answered in that teacher of juries tone he saves for people he thinks will agree with him. Paper whispered against paper. Cypress is a holding structure. That's the point of a holding structure. It holds until it doesn't. A glass hit wood. Why is the savings manager on a first-name basis with you after 1 week? Because I'm charming, Cal said. Because we left him with the impression he's needed. There's a trail, Peter said, ignoring the joke the way smart men do when the joke is in the way. Teletypes leave carbon. Bank officers talk. The relief board wants updates. Your friend on the board asked me today about a timetable. He's not asking because he cares about boats and docks. He's asking because he heard numbers. I rinsed the same leaf 3 times and set it on the towel like something that had confessed. The study door breathed as if it was trying to shrink. We'll consolidate after Labor Day, Cal said. We get the second tranche, we move the cashier's checks, we normalize. It's arithmetic. And the Thursday girl, Peter asked, voice low enough to half hide the name behind it. You handing out pearls and promises now. She is not your concern. It all becomes my concern when names live on paper, Cal. A chair leg scraped the floor, a sound so ordinary it made the ledger in my palm shake. Someone fumbled with the study window latch and the room took a gulp of August. The recorder caught it the way a small machine will catch a life if you put it close enough to where life is happening. They stayed an hour that measured legal hour that always takes longer than a human one. When the door finally opened, I had all the kitchen cabinet doors open as if inventory was my problem. Peter lifted a hand in my direction and let his eyes go everywhere else. Cal kissed me on the cheek the way television husbands do when television wives have set something on the counter worth eating, after dishes and baths and a book with owls that had more patience than any real owl should. I brought the cassette back to the kitchen and slid it into the broken cookie tin we used for pencils. I marked the side with a bit of tape recipes in block letters. I set it behind the flour. Then I boiled tea. I did not need calendar pages fanned under my hand and listened to the fan make of the air a slow decision. Documents tell the truth even when men won't. Monday, when the house emptied into school and office and routine, I carried the brownie down from the hall closet and pinned a muslin towel over the study window to mute the light. The camera felt like a proper tool in my hands, weighty, patient. I opened Cal's case and arranged the papers the way he liked them, edges, good corner square. The relief file wore that blue stamp again, Gulf Rebuild, Relief Disbursements. Beneath it, typed pages lined themselves up in neat blocks, dates, vendor names, check numbers, marching. On a second sheet, a rubber stamp bled onto the margin where someone had handled it too soon. Cypress Holdings, LLC. I took photos slowly, 1-2 holding my breath so as not to stutter the world the way I do when threading a needle through the eye meant for it. The telex copies were carbon blue, the kind of paper that picks up perfume and fingerprints. One bore the routing for cashier's checks from Gulf Coast First Savings to an office on Front Street in Gulfport, then onward to a bank where the name meant to sound international did the work of being vague. The brownie's shutter clicked like a small animal. I replaced sheets exactly where they had lived, slid the case latch home, and set the towel on the back of a chair so the window could be itself again. At Jo Beth's diner that afternoon, the lunch crowd had turned into the hush that comes after. She stood at the pass with her hair escaping the scarf she wore the way a general wears his hat. You look like someone has asked a favor you already agreed to, she said. I need to make copies, I said. The kind that don't belong to the people who made the originals. She did not ask to see a single page. She led me to the back room where the mixer slept, and the chrome shelves held their shining hostage. The lemon meringue sat on a cooling rack, a cloud pretending to be dessert. I know a man who runs to Jackson on Tuesdays with produce, she said. He knows a man who knows a floor in a building where people don't let nonsense live. Write the name you want on the box. Make it pretty since we're pretending. I used my careful hand and a black felt-tip F. Mercer. On the table beside the pie, I arranged what I had my handwritten ledger of dates and check numbers, the jeweler's receipts numbers copied into a clean column, the banking card appointment, carbon pages photographed in duplicates, and the cassette refusing to look like anything but a cassette. I threaded butcher's twine around the box and pulled it tight enough to make the lid behave. "Say it's going to a cousin," Jo Beth said. "He's gotten farther on less." She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned her hip against the table, then softened her voice. "You all right to drive?" "I am," I said, which meant I will be. In the carport, I started the Pontiac and pressed the brake to shift from park. The pedal gave more than it should have a soft sink that didn't match the size of my foot. A spot bloomed under the right rear tire, dark the way water looks when it knows too much. Mr. Delaney from 2 houses down wandered over with a rag in his pocket and a question on his face. "Feels mushy," I said. He crouched, wiped the wet, sniffed. "That ain't water," he said. "That's brake fluid." He slid on his back with his shoulders under the axle, his hand up like a man making a promise. "Well, that's a cut I don't like." He looked at me without standing up. "You hit something." "Nothing I saw," I said, which was true. He stayed there a moment longer, as if listening to the metal. "We'll swap the line before you roll an inch," he said. "My boy can bring me a hose from the shop. You put a kettle on carport where it goes better if the women folk pretend to fuss in the kitchen. Always, I said and felt, the world find a steadier place to stand." I put the kettle on. He fixed the line. I paid him with a 20 that wanted to be a different thing, and a plate of the biscuits we hadn't eaten. He took the biscuits like a gift, and the money like it embarrassed him. When the car admitted its brakes again, I drove the pie to Jo Beth's and watched her hand it to a man who looked like a story people tell about the road, a cap, a tan, a way of standing that meant not to stay. "Jackson by 8, he said, and tapped the lid twice the way men salute a thing they hope will behave. At home, the afternoon made its usual list of sounds. Bus brakes, a neighbor's radio, losing the ball game, someone's sprinkler ticking itself brave. I set beans to simmer and opened the atlas to the Gulf and traced the islands the way Owen did when he couldn't sleep. The cassette sat under the flour tin behind the tin marked recipes. Paper lived where paper lives until it doesn't. 3 days passed in the measured way 3 days pass when your body learns to keep 2 clocks. I hemmed a navy skirt and pretended to fuss over a zipper with a client who wanted her waist to lie about her weekend. June learned to curl her tongue. Owen discovered you can make a compass with a needle and a cork. Cal worked late twice and came home early, once smiling the way men do when they need you to be the proof. On the 4th day, the phone rang, and the ring sounded like the house knew who it was. I wiped my hands and lifted the receiver. "Mrs. Whitaker," a man said, not quite a question. "This is she." "This is Frank Mercer." He said the name unadorned the voice, the kind that asks you to stand up straight without saying so. "I received your package." He waited as if leaves had to lift for a breeze to pass. "All right," I said. "That's all for now." A pause, a line settling onto its hook. "Thank you." Then the click that meant he'd given the phone back to the world. I set the receiver down and let the kitchen return to itself. The steam from the pot made a small weather over the stove. The wall clock decided it could keep time after all. Outside, a gull laughed at something the gull found funny. I put my palm flat on the table, felt its familiar grain under my skin, and listened to the fan finish another circle in a room that smelled like beans and starch and a life laid out straight. The phone's click left a small emptiness that the kitchen accepted without comment. I set the beans to low and let the house scrape by on its evening sounds, the clink of Owen putting a glass in the sink, the sigh of the screen door settling June, humming through a paper doll parade. Cal came home at 7 with courthouse on his breath and hung his jacket so straight it felt like a dare. He spoke of filings and a magistrate with opinions on margins. He said nothing about docs or envelopes or the kind of arithmetic that has to be done standing up. The next morning began the way Gulf mornings do when they choose to mind their manners. White heat behind thin cloud gulls, deciding where to be noisy. I ironed the boys' shirts for Sunday, though it was still Friday, a small superstition I never bothered to name. Cal left early in a tie that made itself busy. He kissed Owen's forehead and told June to feed the cat before lunchtime as if that order could tame a day. By noon, the air turned brittle. Jo Beth slid into the kitchen with a bag of day-old rolls and the corners of her mouth pulled tight. "County cars idling near the courthouse," she said. "Men in sport coats who use the word sir like it's chalk." She didn't add who they might be speaking to. She didn't have to. Near dusk, Cal stood at the hall mirror with a comb and the careful smile he saves for when he wishes to leave with dignity and return with applause. "Bored thing," he said. "Short. Peter's driving." The Pontiac stayed under the carport like an animal that knows thunder before people do. A horn called from the street. I handed Cal his jacket, felt the weight of it, and let the door tell me he'd gone. The house held steady enough for bedtime rituals. June's hair ribbon needed smoothing. Owen asked if I'd seen the moon as if it belonged to us on a schedule. I read the owls again and let them be wise on the page where they are paid to be. In the quiet that comes after children surrender, I wrote a note for Mrs. Delaney, in case the children woke, set it by the phone, took my keys, and stepped into a night that had decided to sweat. Down near the wharf, the air changed from heat to its memory. Boats thumped against their ropes with the patience of animals that know their work. A single sodium light pulled a circle of gold out of the dark, where men usually argue about bait, and last week. I parked 2 blocks off and walked until the boards underfoot started their conversational creak. At the end of the pier, a sedan idled with its lights off. Another rolled up with the confidence of someone invited. I took the place the shadows offered and watched the lights on the bay stitch themselves into a wavering line. The sedan doors opened in that staggered way people use when they pretend not to be together. Cal stepped out, jacket over his arm, the night smoothing his hair. Peter came around the hood and put his hand on the roof like a man who likes to feel steel, remind him of his place in the world. A third man I didn't know lifted a briefcase and set it on a crate, as if to test whether Wood believed in money. Voices carry strange near water. They fall and then travel. I heard Peter say, "We keep this clean," and the stranger say something back that had numbers in it. Cal's tie caught a flicker of the dock light and returned it as a promise. The man opened the case. Even in that light I could see the checks, their pale faces fanned like cards. Peter glanced down the pier, a quick animal move. He did not look far enough. 2 sets of headlights came from opposite ends at once, not cruel, just bright. Red and blue joined them, not siren first, but the wash of color that makes a scene rearrange itself before the sound arrives. Men in windbreakers stepped from shadows with their hands low and their voices just louder than common sense. Marshall's office one said no urgency in it, just the grammar of a thing that's already decided. Another lifted a badge that caught the sodium and made a small sun. Peter's grin tried to show its teeth and then didn't bother. Cal's shoulders squared the way men square themselves when they want to keep furniture from moving. The stranger set his hands where someone told him to set them. The night-spoken instructions and the click of metal meeting wrists. The boat at the next slip banged a little harder, as if to clear its throat, and then quieted. One of the marshals lifted the briefcase and closed it with the respect people give a tool they plan to show a judge. I watched from my place until the pier remembered it was only wood and water and old nails. When the cars moved off, the dark healed over their taillights, as if it had been practicing. I walked back the 2 blocks, letting the sound of my own shoes teach my legs a rhythm that would carry me home. Word arrived the way word arrives in towns like ours. The morning paper folded itself around a headline that rode larger than weather, and the radio cut into a song to mention names as if they were part of the forecast. At 9, a sedan with the federal look pulled into our drive. The marshal who had spoken last night took off his hat on our porch as if the porch might have a temper. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "we're going to need you in Gulfport for some statements." His voice held fairness in one hand and schedule in the other. I found a sitter who didn't ask for details. I kissed my children in the habit of long errands, and I rode in the front with a man who had decided not to fill silence. In a room that smelled like paper and the electricity of machines that don't like to be bored, I sat across from Mr. Mercer and a woman with a legal pad who wrote without looking at her own hand. They asked for dates and names and what I had seen and what I had touched, and whether anything had been moved that should not have been moved. I told the parts that belonged to me and left out the parts that didn't. The cassette sat in its tin at home pretending to be a recipe. No one asked, and I was not in the habit of volunteering. When it was over, Mr. Mercer set his pen down and said nothing useful and nothing unkind. He gave me a glass of water and let me leave without theater. Back on Eisenhower Drive, the blinds remembered how to twitch. Jo Beth arrived with fried chicken and the kind of smile you bring to a house that needs to be told how to use one. Mrs. Delaney pressed a casserole into my hands and said nothing about recipes. Men who had known Cal shook their heads from the driver's seats of their cars as if the engine had suggested it. Children on bikes cut the corners sharper than they had the day before. A week later, a letter from Gulf Coast First Savings addressed itself to the mortgage, as if the mortgage were the only person worth knowing. Delinquency showed up with the kind of formal sorrow that numbers favor. The second letter didn't ask as much as it told. I rang my own bell on 3 doors and found 2 used boxes and 1 woman willing to lend me her tape. Owen packed his rockets and shirts. June wrapped her paper ladies and told them not to fuss. Jo Beth stood in the doorway with a map folded on the wrong lines. "My cousin's diner in Santa Fe needs hands," she said. He's got a room over the kitchen that trembles when the boiler does, and rent that thinks it's doing you a favor. She didn't put a bow on it. She didn't have to. We left without spectacle. The bus hummed a promise that had nothing to do with either of us. Mississippi flattened and rose into Texas, and then the earth turned to a color that belonged to its own opinion. Santa Fe met us with air that knew how to be dry and light, that came from a different set of rules. The diner wore its name in peeling paint, and its welcome without apology. The room above it held 2 iron beds that complained when you looked at them. The boiler introduced itself in the mornings and again in the afternoons, just to make sure you hadn't forgotten. Work is a language, too. I learned the line at the griddle and how the coffee wants to be poured if you want people to come back. In the afternoons, I set up a table by the little window where the sun tried to talk and pulled my machine into service. Word makes its way even when people don't know what to call it. Soon enough there were hems and let-outs, and one woman who said, "You still do wedding dresses," as if saying it might make it true. I told her I did, and meant it by the time I finished the sentence. The second month a woman knocked at the back door of the diner carrying the kind of tired that doesn't look up. Her hair hung loose where it wanted. Her dress was the careful one people save for asking. A baby girl slept on her shoulder with the trust of ships in good harbors. "Mrs. Whitaker," she said, and the vowels put her nearer the Gulf than the mountains. "My name's Lila Monroe." Her name found something already built inside me. She stood without reaching for a chair, as if movement might wake the child. "He wrote me from county," she said quietly. "Said I ought not to expect a thing. The school says there's no place not for now. I can keep books. I can type. I don't need favors. I need work." I had known an anger that sits in the chest and stones itself into a shape. I had also known a kitchen at 6 p.m. that needs a set table more than it needs a speech. "Come upstairs," I said. "We'll see what the numbers think." Lila set the baby in a laundry basket lined with a towel and took a pencil like someone who likes the sound it makes. Her columns stood up straight even when the floor didn't. She found a nickel I had miscounted and a change order I had forgotten to deliver. She didn't rush. She didn't decorate the truth. We ate supper at the little table by the window, the sort of meal that forgives how it was made, and then she wrapped the baby again and looked at me as if the question ought to be asked, and the answer might not be generous. "Can you come tomorrow?" I said. "I can," she said, and meant it with both hands. The next week we carried a second machine up the stairs and 2 racks from a thrift store that had once pretended to be a boutique for other people's dresses. Bolts of fabric leaned like men waiting for a bus that is not coming. A quilt top I'd pieced in a fit of nerves found backing, and then stitches Southwestern reds meeting Gulf blues in a conversation I didn't have to translate. A letter with the county return address arrived with Cal's hand making itself small on the front. I laid it in the tin where the tape and the cassette had learned to live. The boiler took its breath and let it out. The mountain light shifted on the wall until it decided it was evening. I threaded a needle and the day permitted it. Santa Fe taught the afternoons to hush. Light squared itself on the adobe wall above our work table, and the boiler grumbled on schedule like an uncle who loves you but refuses to say so. Lila's pencil kept time down the ledger columns. My needle answered with its own small clicks. The baby Ruthie, a name that sat softly in the mouth, slept in a laundry basket lined with an old flour sack towel. When the bell over the diner door downstairs rang, the sound rose through the floorboards and became part of our day. Word spread the way word always does when it's carried by women with errands. A hem turned into a fitting. A fitting leaned toward a commission. A rancher's wife brought in a wedding dress that had belonged to her mother and asked if memory could be persuaded to fit differently. Lila logged each deposit in the same tidy hand. I basted seams, then stitched for real. By autumn we hung a painted sign, Gulf Threadworks, and propped the door with a brick so the mountain breeze could read our samples. The quilt we'd started as a way to talk without saying much found its place along the back wall. Gulf blues met desert red in squares that didn't apologize for being next to each other. We took it to the state fair in a borrowed truck whose clutch had a mind of its own. People stopped and ran their fingers over the sashings as if touch could interpret color. A judge with a ribbon pinned like a medal nodded once, then again, and set a small card by our name. We brought the quilt home with a new tag and the same weight. Mail arrived in its patient stack. Some of it knew what it was. Orders a note from Joe Beth. A church bulletin that had taken a wrong turn. Some of it pretended not to official envelopes wearing the county seal like a badge. I slid those into the tin where the cassette and its label still said recipes, and the lid closed with a sound that knew its job. The day Cal walked up the outside stairs, the wind had chased the smell of rain into town and left it in our window. He looked smaller in the doorway than men look when they've practiced being large. Time had worked its plain arithmetic on him, thatched gray at the temples, a suit that didn't understand the room eyes cataloging objects the way a man who's lost his place tries to read it back. I set down my needle. Lila straightened the ledger and stood so the chair wouldn't creak for him. I came to see the children, he said, voice careful, as if volume might undo whatever scripts he'd brought. They're not here, I said. You can write them. You can call. They'll decide. He nodded at the quilt, a long blink of recognition without claim. You've made something. We have work, I said. Lila lifted her chin a fraction. Not defiance, not welcome, just the line she had given herself. He turned toward the steps, paused, as if a sentence might discover itself late, and then went down each tread sounding like exactly what it was. Evenings took on their reliable shape. Owen wrote from school about a project that involved magnets and patience. June sent a sketch of a dress with sleeves like swan necks. Ruthie learned to sit up and made her own weather around spoons. Lila began to hum while she wrote a thread of tune that kept the ledger from being a room by itself. Orders came in from farther than we expected. We measured twice because it pleased us to. The old singer's motor warmed the air, and the oil left half moons on the brown paper under the machine feet. On a winter morning, when the sky looked made of chalk, we carried a new bolt to the table and unrolled it. The fabric opened with that faithful sigh cotton gives when it stops pretending to be tight. I chalked a line. Lila checked numbers. Ruthie patted the selvage and laughed at the sound. Outside, the bell over the diner door counted strangers to friends, and back again. Inside, the steam from the iron turned to a thin cloud and rose toward the ceiling where it always disappeared. Toward evening, the mountain light leaned long across the floorboards and climbed the quilt until it found the piece we'd stitched from a dress I used to wear near water. I eased my palm over that square and felt the seam underneath firm and unshowy. The fan turned once, then once more. The sign on the door rocked a little in a breeze that didn't require permission. Lila closed the ledger. I clipped a thread and set it in the little dish we kept for ends. The room arranged itself around the quiet we'd earned and stayed that way. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.